After my husband passed away, my son became the CEO of the family business, and I pretended I hadn't inherited anything. The next day, my daughter-in-law said, "That useless old woman is going to eat up all our money, throw her in a nursing home. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I was arranging fresh lies in the living room when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice drift from the kitchen. The words stopped me cold. "This useless old woman is going to eat through all our money. We need to throw her in a nursing home." Vanessa's voice carried that sharp edge it always had when she thought I couldn't hear her. I stood frozen behind the doorway, the flower stems slipping from my trembling fingers. "I don't know, Vanessa." My son Derek's voice was hesitant. "She's still my mother. Your mother?" Vanessa laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Derek, wake up. She's a burden. Look at this house. She shuffles around here like some ghost contributing nothing. We're paying for her food, her medications, everything. And for what?" My chest tightened. 5 months ago, I'd buried my husband of 40 years. William had built Reynolds Manufacturing from nothing, and I'd stood beside him every step of the way. Now his son spoke about me like I was some stray animal they'd taken in out of pity. "She doesn't even know how to use the computer to manage any of Dad's affairs," Vanessa continued. "Face it, she's useless and expensive." I pressed my back against the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. The funeral seemed like yesterday. I could still smell the lies that had covered William's casket, still feel the weight of Derek's arm around my shoulders as he whispered, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of everything." Everything. That included me, apparently. "There are some nice facilities." Vanessa's voice grew more animated. "Not too expensive. She'd have other people her age to talk to. It would be better for everyone." Better for everyone. The words echoed in my mind as I stood there in my own living room, the room where William and I had raised Derek, where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where we'd built a life together. "I suppose you're right," Derek finally said, and something inside me cracked. She does seem lost without Dad. Maybe being around other people would help. Lost as if grief were some kind of mental deficiency. I thought about the papers I'd signed just days after the funeral. The ones Derek had rushed to me with tear-filled eyes. Just formalities. Mom, he'd said, legal stuff for the business. Dad would want me to handle everything now. What Derek didn't know, what neither of them knew, was what those papers really contained. William had been cleverer than they imagined. Much clever. I owned 72% of Reynolds Manufacturing. The business they thought Derek had inherited. The money they were so eager to spend, the future they were planning, it all belonged to me. William had structured it that way years ago, protecting our assets in ways that wouldn't be discovered unless someone looked very, very carefully. But I'd let them believe the lie. I'd played the grieving widow, confused by legal terms, and grateful to let her capable son handle the complicated business matters. It had seemed easier than fighting, easier than confronting the ugly truth about who my son had become. "When should we start looking at places?" Derek asked. "I'll make some calls tomorrow," Vanessa replied. "The sooner the better." I'm tired of tiptoeing around her. Tiptoeing around me in my own home. I heard footsteps approaching and quickly moved toward the staircase, climbing as quietly as my 70-year-old knees would allow. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed William and I had shared for decades, staring at the framed photo of our wedding day. "They don't know, do they?" I whispered to his smiling face. "They have no idea what you really left behind." William had always been protective of me, sometimes to a fault. "Promise me," he'd said during those final weeks in the hospital. "If something happens to me, If Derek ever treats you poorly, you'll use what I'm leaving you. Don't let anyone push you around, Maggie. I'd promised, but I'd never imagined I'd need to keep that promise so soon. The next morning, Vanessa cornered me over breakfast. Derek had already left for the office that was technically mine, and she sat across from me with that practiced smile she used when she wanted something. Maggie, honey, we need to talk. I continued buttering my toast, not trusting my voice. Derek and I have been thinking about your living situation. We know how lonely you must be in this big house. Lonely as if the house itself were the problem, not the fact that my own family treated me like an unwelcome stranger. We found some lovely senior communities places where you'd have activities people your own age. You might actually enjoy it. I looked up at her, then really looked at her. Vanessa was 36, beautiful in that sharp, calculated way that came from expensive treatments and careful maintenance. She'd married Derek 3 years ago, and I'd tried so hard to welcome her to be the mother-in-law she needed. Now I could see what I'd been blind to before. The way her eyes assessed everything in the room like an appraiser. The way she spoke about my future as if it were already decided. When I asked quietly, she blinked clearly, surprised I wasn't arguing. Well, we thought maybe next week. I've already scheduled a tour for Thursday. Next week, they'd already made the appointment. I see, I said, returning to my toast. You're not upset, are you? Vanessa's voice carried a note of suspicion. I mean, this is really what's best for everyone. I met her eyes and smiled the same polite smile I'd been wearing for months. Of course, dear. Whatever you think is best. But inside, something was shifting. William's voice echoed in my memory. Don't let anyone push you around, Maggie. The time for being pushed around was over. Maplewood Estates wasn't the lovely senior community Vanessa had described. The beige walls were stained with water damage. The carpet smelled of disinfectant and something else I didn't want to identify. And my room was barely larger than a hotel bathroom. This is temporary, Derek had mumbled when he'd helped carry my 2 allowed suitcases inside. He couldn't meet my eyes. Just until we figure out the best long-term solution. That was 3 weeks ago. I hadn't heard from him since. I sat in the common room watching Claire Johnson play solitaire with a deck missing the Queen of Hearts. Through the window, I could see my former life continuing without me. The maple tree in the courtyard was turning the same brilliant red it had in my backyard every October for 40 years. You're the new one, aren't you? The voice belonged to Eleanor Ellie Thompson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who used a walker but moved with surprising speed. Your family dump you here too? I turned from the window. Something like that. Ellie snorted. They always have their reasons. Mine said I was becoming a safety risk after I fell down once. Once 30 years I raised those kids and one little tumble means I'm incompetent. The common room filled with the usual afternoon crowd. Most residents shuffled in wearing the same defeated expression as if they'd given up expecting anything good to happen. I understood that feeling now. What did you do before this? Ellie asked, settling into the chair beside me. I helped run a business with my husband. It wasn't technically true, but it felt true. William and I had been partners in everything. What kind of business? Manufacturing industrial parts? Eleanor's eyebrows rose. Sounds important. It was. I watched a group of residents arguing over the television remote. My son runs it now. Ah, Eleanor nodded knowingly. And how's that working out? I thought about the reports I'd been secretly receiving from David Collins, William's old attorney. Derek had made 3 major decisions in the past month, all of them terrible. He'd canceled contracts with longtime suppliers to chase cheaper alternatives, laid off experienced workers to cut costs, and approved a new product line without proper market research. Not well, I admitted. They never listen, do they think? Because we're old, we don't know anything. Eleanor's voice carried decades of frustration. My daughter reorganized my entire financial portfolio without asking me. Lost 20% in the first 6 months. That evening, I called David Collins from the payphone in the hallway. The connection was crackling and poor, but his voice was clear enough. "Mrs. Maggie, I'm glad you called. We need to discuss the Lakeside Corp. account." Lakeside was Reynolds Manufacturing's biggest client, responsible for nearly 32% of annual revenue. "What about it?" "Your son terminated the contract yesterday. Said he found a better opportunity." My grip tightened on the phone. William had cultivated the Lakeside relationship for 15 years. What better opportunity? A startup company, no established track record. They're offering 18% higher margins, but Mrs. Reynolds. David paused. "I've done some research. They're funded by venture capital that's already showing signs of stress. This could be a disaster." I closed my eyes, feeling William's presence like a whisper in my ear. He'd always said the most dangerous time for any business was when inexperienced hands took control during emotional periods. "David, I need you to do something for me." Quietly. "Of course. I want you to document every decision Derek makes, every contract change, every personnel move, every financial choice. Can you do that without him knowing?" "Absolutely. And Mrs. Reynolds, there's something else. Your daughter-in-law has been asking questions about your personal assets. She seems to think you might have hidden accounts or property she doesn't know about." I almost laughed. Vanessa's greed was showing. What kind of questions she wanted to know if you had any stocks, bonds, or real estate holdings that weren't part of the general estate. I told her I couldn't discuss client confidentiality matters, but she was quite persistent. Of course she was. Vanessa had probably been counting every penny they thought they'd inherited. And now, she was worried there might be more money floating around that they couldn't access. "Don't tell her anything I said. And David, I want you to start preparing some paperwork for me. I may need to make some changes soon." When I returned to my room, I found my roommate, Edna Miller, sitting on her bed, looking distressed. She was holding a letter, her hands shaking. "Bad news?" I asked gently. "My grandson," she whispered. "He was supposed to visit last weekend and the weekend before. He keeps promising, but she didn't need to finish." I'd seen this pattern in other residents. The promises that gradually became excuses, the visits that grew farther apart, the phone calls that stopped coming altogether. "I raised him after his parents died," Edna continued. "Sacrificed everything to give him a good life, and now he's too busy to spend an hour with me." I sat on my own narrow bed, studying the woman across from me. She'd given everything to family just like I had, just like Eleanor had, just like most of the women in this place. "Edna," I said, carefully, "did you ever think about what you'd do if you had the power to change things? If you weren't as helpless as they think you are?" She looked up confused. "What do you mean?" "Just a thought experiment. If you could somehow take control of your own life again, would you?" Her eyes brightened for the first time since I'd known her in a heartbeat. That night, I lay in my narrow bed, listening to Edna's gentle snoring and Eleanor's muttered complaints from down the hall. Through the thin walls, I could hear someone crying softly in the next room. This place was full of women who'd been discarded, told they were burdens, convinced they were powerless. But I wasn't powerless. I just hadn't decided to use my power yet. I thought about Derek sitting in William's office, making decisions that would destroy everything his father had built. I thought about Vanessa probably redecorating my house with money she thought was hers, selling my personal belongings like they were garage sale items. Tomorrow, I decided I would call David Collins again. It was time to remind my family that power doesn't always come in the package they expect. Outside my window, a storm was building. I could see lightning flickering in the distance, and the wind was picking up, rattling the old building's windows. The storm wasn't just outside, though. It was growing inside me, too. And Derek and Vanessa had no idea what was coming their way. There has to be more money somewhere. Vanessa's voice carried down the hallway of Maplewood Estates as she and Derek approached my room. I quickly closed the financial documents David had brought me and slipped them under my pillow. Through the crack in my door, I could see them walking with purpose, Vanessa clutching a manila folder. "Mom!" Derek knocked softly. "Can we come in?" I arranged myself on my bed, making sure to look frail and confused. "Of course, dear." They entered my cramped room, and I watched Vanessa's nose wrinkle at the institutional smell. She was wearing a new coat, cashmere by the look of it, expensive. "My money, probably." "How are you feeling?" Derek asked, but his eyes were darting around the room, not really seeing me. "Oh, some days are better than others." I let my voice quaver slightly. "The food here isn't very good." Vanessa shot Derek a look that said, "Get on with it." She was never good at hiding her impatience. "Mom, we need to ask you about some financial matters," Derek said, settling into the room's single chair. "When Dad died, there were some inconsistencies in the paperwork." I blinked slowly, playing confused. What kind of inconsistencies? Vanessa couldn't contain herself any longer. "Maggie, we found references to accounts and assets that aren't in the estate documents. We need to know what William might have hidden from us." Hidden from us. Not hidden from me. Hidden from them. "I don't understand." I said, "Your father handled all the financial matters. I never really paid attention to those things." It was partially true. William had handled the day-to-day operations, but I'd been involved in every major decision. We'd been partners in everything, even if I'd preferred to work behind the scenes. Derek leaned forward. "Mom, this is important. The business is having some cash flow problems. And if there are additional assets cash flow problems?" David had told me about those. Derek's terrible decisions were already catching up with him. "What kind of problems?" I asked innocently. Vanessa and Derek exchanged another look. "Nothing serious," Vanessa said quickly. "Just normal business fluctuations, but we need to have a complete picture of all available resources." "Available resources?" They meant my resources. "I really don't know anything about hidden accounts," I said truthfully. "There weren't any hidden accounts, just accounts they didn't know belonged to me. Your father always said I didn't need to worry about money matters." "Think, Mom." Derek's voice carried a note of desperation. "Did he ever mention offshore accounts, investment properties, stocks, and other companies?" I studied my son's face. The stress was showing. Dark circles under his eyes. A nervous tick. I remembered from his childhood when he'd done something wrong. The weight of running a company he didn't understand was crushing him. Part of me felt sorry for him. But then I remembered the conversation I'd overheard. The dismissive way they'd discussed putting me somewhere with other people my age, and my sympathy evaporated. "There might be some old papers in the house," I said slowly. "In your father's study, but I'm not sure what they mean." Vanessa's eyes lit up. "What kind of papers?" "Investment statements, I think. Some legal documents. They're in the filing cabinet behind his desk." It was true, though the documents they'd find wouldn't tell them what they wanted to know. William had been careful to keep certain information in very specific places accessible only to people who knew exactly what to look for. "We'll check those," Derek said, standing up. "Is there anything else you can remember?" I let myself look tired and overwhelmed. "I'm sorry. Sometimes my memory isn't what it used to be." Another partial truth. My memory was fine, but grief and stress had made me more forgetful about small things, about the important things like who owned what and where William had hidden our real assets. My mind was crystal clear. After they left, I waited 20 minutes before calling David Collins from the hallway phone. "They're getting desperate," I told him. "How bad are things at the company? Worse than I thought." The Lakeside Corp. Contract cancellation has triggered a chain reaction. 2 other major clients are reconsidering their relationships with Reynolds Manufacturing. Your son is scrambling to cover operating expenses. I closed my eyes. William had built that company over 35 years. Watching Derek destroy it in a matter of months was like watching someone tear down a cathedral brick by brick. "There's something else," David continued. "Your daughter-in-law hired a private investigator to look into your background, specifically your financial background." My grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of investigation? They're looking for hidden assets, undisclosed investments, anything that might not have been included in the probate documents. She's convinced you're hiding money from them." The irony was almost funny. They were looking for hidden money when the money they thought they had wasn't really theirs to begin with. "David, I need you to accelerate our timeline. How quickly can you prepare the documents we discussed? I can have everything ready by Friday. Are you sure you want to do this?" I thought about my cramped room, about Edna Miller crying over her grandson's broken promises, about Eleanor's daughter stealing her money, about the way Vanessa had looked at me like I was garbage cluttering up her perfect life. "I'm sure." That afternoon, I was sitting in the common room when Eleanor approached with a newspaper in her hand. "Thought you might want to see this," she said, spreading the business section on the table between us. The headline made my stomach drop. "Local manufacturing company faces major layoffs." The article was about Reynolds Manufacturing. According to sources close to the company, I read aloud. "Reynolds Manufacturing has lost several major contracts in recent months, forcing management to consider significant workforce reductions. The company, which has been family-owned for over 35 years, is struggling to adapt to changing market conditions under new leadership." New leadership. They meant Derek. "That your son's company?" Eleanor asked. I nodded, unable to speak. "Sounds like he's in over his head." I thought about all the employees who'd worked for William for years, people I'd known personally, families who depended on their Reynolds Manufacturing paychecks. Derek wasn't just destroying his father's legacy, he was destroying real people's lives. "Eleanor," I said suddenly, "what would you do if you had the power to stop something terrible from happening, but using that power would hurt someone you love?" She looked at me shrewdly. "Depends on how much hurt we're talking about. Sometimes the people we love need to face consequences for their actions. Sometimes that's the only way they learn." That evening, Edna Miller showed me a photo her grandson had finally sent. A picture of his new car, a Cadillac. "Very expensive. He said he's been too busy with work to visit," she said proudly. "But he's doing so well for himself." I stared at the photo, remembering Vanessa's new coat, thinking about all the ways money could corrupt people, make them forget what really mattered. My grandson had bought a car instead of visiting his grandmother who'd raised him. My son had inherited a thriving business and was running it into the ground. My daughter-in-law was hunting for more money to spend while I ate cafeteria food in a nursing home. The time for protecting people from consequences was over. I went to bed that night with my mind made up. Friday couldn't come soon enough. The phone call came at 6:00 in the morning. I was already awake, sitting by my window, watching the sunrise, when the payphone in the hallway began ringing insistently. Most residents ignored early calls, assuming they were wrong numbers or emergencies meant for someone else, but I knew this call was for me. "Mrs. Reynolds." David Collins' voice was tense. "I'm sorry to call so early, but we have a situation." "How bad?" "Your son is filing for emergency bankruptcy protection. The company is hemorrhaging money faster than anyone anticipated. He's desperate." I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar mix of sorrow and vindication. William had always said that pride comes before the fall, and Derek's pride had been enormous. What triggered it? The Summit Industries contract. You remember Summit Industries? They've been with Reynolds Manufacturing for 15 years. Your son tried to renegotiate their terms, demanding a 20% price increase. They walked away yesterday and signed with a competitor. Summit Industries represented 14% of Reynolds' annual revenue. Combined with the Lakeside loss and the other canceled contracts, Derek had managed to lose nearly half the company's income in 3 months. There's more, David continued. Your daughter-in-law has been liquidating personal assets. The house is going on the market today. My house. The house where I'd raised Derek. Where William and I had celebrated 40 anniversaries, where I'd planned to live out my remaining years surrounded by memories. She can't sell my house, I said. Though even as I spoke the words, I knew she could. Legally, it wasn't my house anymore. I'd signed it over to Derek after the funeral, trusting him to let me live there as long as I wanted. Trust. Such a fragile thing. Actually, she can, David said gently. According to the documents you signed, the house belongs to Derek now, and since he's married, Vanessa has equal rights to make decisions about it. I thought about all my belongings still inside. Photo albums, William's books, my grandmother's china, 40 years of accumulated memories, things that couldn't be replaced. What about my personal items? I'm afraid they're considered part of the household assets. Now, unless you can prove specific items were gifts or have sentimental value that predates the marriage, he didn't need to finish. Proving sentimental value in court would be expensive and time-consuming. And I was supposed to be a confused old woman with no money. Are they moving forward with the sale immediately? The realtor is taking photos this afternoon. They're pricing it to sell quickly. I hung up the phone and stood in the hallway for a long moment, letting the reality sink in. My son was destroying everything his father had built, and my daughter-in-law was selling my memories to pay for their mistakes. The anger that rose in my chest was white-hot and clean. I called Derek's office, knowing he'd be there early, probably staring at spreadsheets and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Mom, his voice was exhausted. How did you get this number? I called the main line and asked for you. Simple truth. Derek, I heard about the company. Are you all right? A long pause. Who told you about the company? It's in the newspaper, dear. And some of the other residents here have family who work in manufacturing. Word gets around. I'm handling it, he said, but his voice cracked slightly. It's just a temporary setback, Derek. I let my voice carry all the authority I'd learned over 40 years of partnership with his father. Bankruptcy protection isn't temporary. It's admitting defeat. You don't understand business. Mom, this is just a strategic reorganization. The condescension in his tone sparked something dangerous in me. William would have been ashamed of the man his son had become. I understand that your father built that company from nothing, I said quietly. And you've destroyed it in 3 months. That's not fair. What's not fair is watching you throw away 35 years of work because you're too proud to admit you don't know what you're doing. Silence on the other end. Derek, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Are you selling my house? Another pause, longer this time. Mom, we need the capital. The house is just sitting there, and with your medical expenses and the nursing home costs. My medical expenses. My voice rose. What medical expenses? I take 2 prescription medications that cost less than $50 a month. Well, the nursing home. The nursing home you chose. The nursing home you put me in so I wouldn't be inconvenient anymore. That's not why. Then why, Derek? Why exactly did you put your mother in this place? The silence stretched between us filled with all the words he couldn't say. Because Vanessa wanted me gone. Because I was a reminder of their failure to honor his father's memory. Because it was easier to hide me away than deal with the guilt of how they'd treated me. The house has to be sold, he said finally. I'm sorry. I hung up without saying goodbye. That afternoon, I sat in the common room with Eleanor and Edna Miller watching a game show on the television, but my mind was elsewhere, calculating and planning. You're thinking hard about something, Eleanor observed. Want to share? I looked at these two women, smart, experienced, reduced to watching television in a place that smelled like disinfectant and despair. Women who'd given their lives to family members who'd discarded them the moment they became inconvenient. What if I told you there was a way to take back some control? I said quietly. Not just for me, but for all of us. Edna muted the television. What do you mean? I mean, what if the people who put us here had to face real consequences for their actions? What if they discovered that we're not as powerless as they think? Eleanor's eyes sharpened. Go on. Some of us in this place aren't as helpless as our families believe. Some of us have resources they don't know about, power they've forgotten we have. I thought about the documents David was preparing, about the bomb I was about to drop on Derek and Vanessa's carefully constructed life. Are you talking about fighting back? Edna asked. I'm talking about justice, I said. I'm talking about reminding our families that respect isn't optional and that treating people badly has consequences. Eleanor leaned forward. What kind of consequences? I smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a real smile. The kind that changes everything. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, but this time, I wasn't going to wait for the storm to pass. I was going to be the storm. The emergency shareholders meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 a.m. I had David arrange it under the pretense of addressing the company's financial crisis. What Derek didn't know was that I'd called the meeting myself as the majority shareholder of Reynolds Manufacturing. I chose my outfit carefully, my best navy dress, the one I'd worn to board meetings back when William was alive. I'd had Eleanor help me with my hair, pulling it back into the severe bun I used to wear when I meant business. You look like you're going to war, Eleanor said approvingly. I am. The taxi ride to the Reynolds Manufacturing building felt like a journey back in time. I hadn't been here since William's funeral, when Derek had insisted I didn't need to worry about complicated business matters anymore. The conference room was exactly as I remembered it. Mahogany table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Eastbrook Industrial Park William had helped develop. Derek sat at the head of the table in his father's chair, papers scattered in front of him. He looked up when I entered, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and annoyance. Mom, what are you doing here? Vanessa was beside him, dressed in another expensive outfit I'd probably paid for. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently on the table. This is a business meeting, Maggie, she said coldly. Not a social visit. I took the seat at the opposite end of the table, my usual spot from the old days. David entered behind me carrying a leather briefcase that made Vanessa's eyes narrow with suspicion. Derek, I said calmly. I called this meeting. He blinked. You called it. Mom, you're not. He stopped, seeming to realize how that sentence would sound. I'm not what? Not part of this company. I folded my hands on the table. David, would you please explain to my son exactly what his mother's role in Reynolds Manufacturing is? David opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of documents. Mrs. Maggie Reynolds owns 72% of Reynolds Manufacturing and Care. She has been the majority shareholder since the company's incorporation in 1987. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Vanessa went completely still, her face draining of color. That's impossible, Derek finally managed. Dad left the company to me. I saw the will. The will left you 28% ownership and operational control. David continued, his voice professionally neutral. However, your father structured the ownership to protect your mother's interests. She has always held the controlling stake. I watched my son process this information, saw the exact moment when the implications hit him. Every decision he'd made, every contract he'd canceled, every employee he'd fired. All of it had been done with my property. You knew. Vanessa's voice was barely a whisper. All this time you knew. I knew, I said simply. Just like I knew when you decided to put me in a nursing home. Just like I knew when you sold my personal belongings. Just like I knew when you put my house on the market. Derek found his voice. Mom, if you owned the company, why didn't you say something? Why let me destroy it? I finished. Because I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become without your father's guidance. I wanted to see if you'd earned the right to run his company. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a shroud. And what's your assessment? Vanessa asked her lawyer, instincts kicking in despite her shock. I looked at my son. Really looked at him, the boy I'd raised, the young man who'd graduated with honors, the husband and father who should have been everything William and I had dreamed he'd become. My assessment is that you failed completely. Derek flinched as if I'd slapped him. In 3 months, you've lost 40% of this company's revenue. You've laid off 36 employees, many of whom worked for your father for over a decade. You've made decisions based on spreadsheets instead of relationships, on quick profits instead of long-term stability. I stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the factory floor. But the business failures aren't what disappoint me most. Then what? Derek's voice was small. I turned back to face them. What disappoints me is that you put your own mother in a substandard nursing home and sold her house to cover your mistakes. What disappoints me is that you convinced yourself I was a burden instead of a resource. What disappoints me is that you forgot every value your father tried to teach you about family and loyalty and respect. Vanessa straightened in her chair, her composure returning. What do you want, Maggie? Money and apology? What's this really about? This is about consequences, I said. Derek, you're fired. Effective immediately, he shot to his feet. You can't fire me. This is my inheritance. No, I said calmly. This is my company. Your inheritance was the opportunity to prove yourself worthy of running it. You've proven the opposite. David placed a document in front of me. Mrs. Reynolds, this removes Derek Reynolds from all operational roles within the company effective immediately. Your signature is required. I signed my name with steady hands. What about the bankruptcy filing? Vanessa demanded. Will be withdrawn. I'm injecting capital to stabilize operations. I looked at Derek, whose face had gone ashen. The company will survive under new management. Mom, please, Derek said, his voice breaking. I made mistakes, but I can learn. I can do better. For a moment, I wavered. He was still my son. I still loved him despite everything. But then I thought about Edna Miller crying over her grandson's empty promises. I thought about Eleanor, whose daughter had stolen her money. I thought about all the women at Maplewood Estates who'd been discarded by families they'd sacrificed everything for. You had your chance, Derek. You chose to see me as a burden instead of asking for my help. You chose to hide me away instead of honoring me. Those weren't business decisions.